Hey friends, welcome to Bokeh, a podcast exploring the ever-blurring lines between the personal and business lives of professional photographers. This is your host, Nathan Holritz, and I'm happy that you can join me in connecting with photographers and entrepreneurs as we discuss photography, business, and that sometimes messy thing we call life. This podcast is brought to you by Milu, the simplest way for photographers and coordinators to collaborate on shot lists and timelines for weddings, parties, and other amazing events. Visit Milu, MIILU.com. This podcast is also brought to you by Photographers Edit, custom image editing for the professional photographer. Visit photographersedit.com. All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we are back for another Bokeh Podcast episode, and we are joined by yet another brand new guest, Lucy Baber. Thank you so much, Lucy, for hanging out with me today.
Hey, Nathan. Thanks for having me.
I already commented, to kind of break the fourth wall here for our listeners, I already commented on the fact that you've got some of the best audio that I've heard in our show yet. It's always a welcome surprise when I log on to the Zoom call with our guests and I hear great audio. And so that's always a good first step in the right direction. But in all seriousness, we're actually going to get into a really interesting conversation today. You and I had the opportunity to meet at the Cookout conference and have a bit of conversation, and you were sharing about a personal project at that point that was quite fascinating, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail later. We're also going to talk about how our listeners can go about planning their next personal project. You've got some recommendations with that, so we'll get to all that in just a bit, but my first and certainly favorite question at this point that I ask our guests on the podcast is about brand position. You're a photographer based in what market?
So I'm a Philadelphia family and lifestyle newborn photographer.
Okay. So if I were to ask, normally I kind of formally ask the question, what is your brand position? Is that how you would sum it up, or how do you communicate it to your clients on the website or otherwise?
So I market myself as Philadelphia's fun family photographer.
Okay.
I even capitalize the word fun. Which is maybe corny, I don't know.
No, I like it actually. And by the way, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but everybody listening in, if you go to lucybaberphotography.com, you can see exactly what Lucy's talking about here. And she literally has those 5 words in big, bold text on the homepage of her website, above the fold, simple, concise. You're doing everything right, Lucy. This is great. Philly's fun family photographer. But let me let you continue to expound on it.
Yeah. So my sessions are super relaxed, and they're really focused on connections and playing with loved ones and family members. It's especially common for dads, which I know can sometimes get a bad rep in the family photography world, to actually thank me at the end of a session. And a lot of times they'll say, I thought this was going to be really boring and stressful, but you made it totally easy. I even had one dad say, this felt like a date, which is the highest compliment I could ever get. So it really is. My goal is to just help families remember how they felt about each other. It's really hard to give an authentic expression when you're looking at a camera because you and that camera just met. But so I try to get them to interact with each other so that they'll really remember what that relationship was like later on.
Wow. That's really cool. Really to actually hear that kind of feedback from clients that they are genuinely excited. Guys do get kind of a bad rap for their involvement or approach to photographic sessions, and for good reason, but to actually get that kind of feedback from them, that's really, really cool. But I have to get back to this very simple, clear, concise brand position statement, and honestly, probably one of the best that I've heard on the show yet, and not just for what it communicates, but also the way that you actually have it posted on your website. And this is really key. Everybody who listens into the Bokeh Podcast on a regular basis, you know that we talk about the brand position idea incessantly, largely because most photographers don't do it very well. And in a noisy world that we live in with just endless numbers of photographers all over now, we need to figure out clear and concise ways to communicate how we're different than the so-called competition in our local market. And so Lucy does a really great job of it. First of all, she and just to remind everybody, it's Philly's fun family photographer. So she starts with what market she is serving as far as location is concerned. Fun is, and I mean, it seems simplistic, but the reality is, and as Lucy was alluding to, many family sessions can seem like a drag. They can seem kind of boring and annoying and frustrating, and kids are screaming and people are crying, and partners are annoyed with each other. I mean, isn't necessarily the best experience. But you immediately emphasize the fact that this is going to be fun. And most photographers, I mean, I can't think of a photographer offhand actually that actually comes out and uses that word specifically in their brand position statement, period, and certainly not in Philly. So you've got Philly's fun, and then family photographer, you're specifying the genre of photography that you specialize in, or noting the genre that you specialize in. I mean, really, this is beautifully, beautifully done. And to reemphasize what I said earlier, it's above the fold. So for those of you listening in, if on your website, your potential client doesn't land on your website and immediately within 2-3 seconds know who you're serving or who the photographer is serving, how they're serving them in a unique way, and in this case, where they're serving them, then you're missing out on an opportunity to create some distinction. And so major props to you, Lucy. I mean, this is a really great example of a good brand position.
Thank you. I have to give away a little bit of my secret.
Please.
It wasn't all me. I worked through, is it Donald Miller, the Story brand?
Yeah.
I mean, when I went through it, I was kind of like, oh gosh, this feels so huge and overwhelming. But the more I kind of honed it down, the more it just kind of fell into place. So I would highly recommend that resource if you haven't looked into it yet.
Oh my goodness. We talk about that book incessantly as well. I mean, it is seriously one of the best business books that I've read, largely because, a lot of business books, and you may have experienced this, Lucy, when you read a business book, 75-80% of it's just kind of fluff and filler. And then you finally get to the stuff that's helpful. The thing about Donald's book, or one of the wonderful things about Donald's book, is that so much of the book is actually practical and actionable. It's certainly easy to read. And it does actually require a little bit of work, as Lucy pointed out. But they have a website as well that you can go in. It's almost like its own worksheet, and you can fill the information in and really work on refining your brand position. And one of the things that Donald talks about that we've also talked about here on the show is the significance of speaking to how you add value to the potential client's life, how you make them the hero of their story, versus just kind of emphasizing how great you are. And when you're talking, Lucy, about how you are a fun family photographer, we're really talking about the experience that you're going to give to this potential client, the way that you uniquely handle these portrait sessions. And I think that's a great example of speaking to the value you bring to the potential client's life. So yeah, everybody, we're going to link to that book in the show notes. And by the way, we have something new at the Bokeh Podcast, or on the Bokeh Podcast site. If you go to bokehpodcast.com, you'll see this, BOKEH podcast.com. It's called the Bokeh Bookshelf. And actually, you can go directly to bokehbookshelf.com as well. And you'll see this, but Haley, who produces the show, has put together a compilation of our guests' favorite books, and in various categories as well. Donald's book is certainly one of those. It's one that I talk about quite a bit. But make sure you take advantage of that. If you're looking for that next business book to read or self-help book to read, we've compiled a list of some of the best, and certainly those that have been noted most often here on the show. And you can check those out at bokehbookshelf.com. Kind of fun.
I love that. I'm a huge reader. And also shout out to Haley, because I love her. We spent time together at the cookout.
Yeah. No, she's incredible. And she's done so much for the Bokeh Podcast and Photographers Edit as well. And so if anybody doesn't know who Haley is, the very fact that you're listening to this show right now happens largely because of all the work that she does. So yeah, definitely major shout out to Haley. She is listening in now as she's editing the show. Hey, Haley. But let's keep moving because we've got a lot to cover. So I want to talk about your experience as a photographer and one of the biggest lessons that you've learned. But just to give context, how many years have you been in business for yourself?
So I opened up shop on it, like kind of on a low key basis in 2011,
Okay.
but by the end of 2012, I had gone full time, which, by the way, I would not recommend.
Oh, really?
Give yourself a little bit of time to work up to that. But mine
Okay.
was kind of born out of necessity. So since 2012, and it's 2020 now, so we're going to say that's 8 years.
Which is incredible, by the way. But I have to ask, why would you not recommend going full time that quickly?
Well, I mean, full disclosure, I didn't always pay all my bills that first year.
Fair. Yeah.
I had, and this is kind of a tangent. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but before I was a photographer, I was a child therapist.
Wow.
And I had to leave that field for a number of reasons, primarily because I had my own baby and did not anticipate how difficult it would be to hear child abuse stories when I was raising my own baby. So I needed to step away from that, which is kind of the born out of necessity piece. But if I could do it over, I would have waited to leave my day job until my part-time photography gig was feeling more sustainable and full-time. I just kind of jumped and hoped that the net caught me. And thankfully, we made it work in a variety of ways, but the net wasn't really there when I jumped. So,
well, and you talked before we started recording, you were talking to me about how you ended up implementing IPS, or maybe more specifically virtual IPS, and tripled your sales, which I think is just begging another podcast episode. So maybe we'll be lucky enough to have you back on. But what would you say then is over the last 8 years or so, one of the most important lessons that you've learned, maybe the first lesson that you would want to share with a fellow photographer or entrepreneur?
Well, so my prepared answer is different than the answer that feels like it flows with what we just talked about. So I'm going to give two. Okay. Obviously, what I just said was get yourself steady with income before you make the leap to full time. That is going to look different for a lot of different photographers, but just make sure that it feels sustainable, because this is really seasonal work, and what might feel like a really great season can quickly turn into a really dry season right after that. So if you don't have a solid plan for all of those months of the year, it can be really hard to stick with it. But in addition to that, one of the things that I learned, thankfully, early on is to find a group of other business owners for mutual support. Facebook is fantastic for that. I actually started a private Facebook group like 6 or 7 years ago with other photographers in business, which is, especially in the mom photography world, can be kind of hard to find people who are really focused on growing a sustainable business as opposed to just doing it as a hobby. But one of the things that was unique about this group is that none of us were in each other's local market, so that we were able to freely share ideas, brainstorm, vent to each other, troubleshoot issues, and just kind of learn alongside each other and support each other, because otherwise, I'm sitting in this house all by myself all day, and it can be really lonely and frustrating to have to feel like you have to recreate the wheel all by yourself. That's just not the case. There are so many resources out there, and the resource I think sometimes we overlook is people. Real life people can be there to help, because we're all doing the same work.
Well, and you spoke to Facebook. Talk to me about your thoughts on the difference between the experience connecting with photographers on Facebook, which, by the way, I realize there's quite a bit of significance to, but the distinction between that and actually making the time to connect in person too, because you talked about how you're in your house alone otherwise. And I mean, I can very much relate, despite the fact that I am an owner of a company that's had the opportunity to work with thousands of photographers. I'm still in an apartment alone quite a bit of the time. I mean, it's kind of a weird irony. And so how important, and I guess in some ways this is rhetorical, but in a day where Facebook, there's so much priority on Facebook and people tend to stay on Facebook versus making the effort to drive 20 minutes to go have coffee, because that's, quote, too far to drive. What would you say is the distinction and ultimately the significance of meeting in person versus just being on Facebook?
So I think that's a great question. And honestly, I make it a point to prioritize both. I definitely work hard to maintain in-person relationships with local photographers, but it is going to have a different flavor, right? Like my friends who are local photographers, sometimes we literally have the same client inquiry sitting in our inbox. So we're not always, as much as I believe in like the community over competition idea, like it's still important to have a resource and a group of business owners who, first of all, are more self-selected because you're going to be able to find easier on Facebook. You're going to be able to find people who have a closer match to your specific goals, because you're kind of not stuck, but you're stuck with whoever's local when you're meeting up in person. And sometimes, like a lot of my friends, even in the past 5 to 10 years, have had to close up shop for different reasons. And that narrows that pool of that network of friends. Some of them have had great opportunities come up. Some of them, unfortunately, just didn't feel like the market was sustainable enough for them. And so finding people who were really kind of better matched to where I am and that kind of like, this has to work mentality was important for me. But also, I definitely especially now that my kids are in school, I've prioritized, I try to give myself Fridays off, which it doesn't always happen exactly. Like the full day is my only day off, but otherwise, you can work around the clock. And on those Fridays is when I try to do more of my in-person meet for coffee. I started, I think you actually spoke with Ray Barnes on the podcast.
Yes.
In the past, she lives 20 minutes from me, and we even met for pedicures one day just to kind of chat about work. And we realized we could spend $5 on coffee or a little bit more to get some cute toes and have a little massage chair involved. So that was fantastic.
Yeah. Shout out to Ray, by the way. She was on the podcast back in episode 157. Actually, we were talking about 5 steps to better album sales. So we'll link to that in the show notes for anybody who's curious.
Awesome. Yeah, she's fantastic. And I also, in the past 2 years, especially, have really prioritized attending photography conferences. I know lots of people have different goals for those, but for me, my biggest priority for attending those conferences is the networking. And when I say networking, I don't mean like pushing myself on people.
Handing out business cards. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not there to part of it is expanding your network and kind of doing whatever goals you have in mind, but it's also just to kick back with other people who get it. So sometimes, this is my dirty secret a little bit. Sometimes I don't even go to all the classes at photography conferences because it's more important to me if somebody says, hey, we're going to go do this cool local thing. Do you want to grab an Uber? Or we're just meeting up to swap headshots, or we just want to go have a really great local meal. I want to have that flexibility, or even just my roommate saying, I just want to go take a nap. Do you want to go hang out in the room, in the hotel room? That is super important to me, to be able to have that flexibility, be with real human beings, and not just look at a computer screen all day. I tend to have quite a bit of bias toward the significance of spending time in person. Honestly, I really can't minimize the significance of the online community, because that's largely how I was able to function as a photographer. When I was shooting weddings, and I shot for over 10 years, we were heavily involved in, back then it wasn't Facebook groups, it was online forums, and one in particular. And that forum, we connected virtually, but then we actually had in-person meetups from that group in various places in the country, and just developed some really cool friendships as a result. You just can't compare anything to actual in-person conversation where you're looking at somebody in the face and you can give them a hug and you can read their expression. And I guess ultimately, and again, I understand I'm biased largely just because I have a strong craving for connection with people. But I'm just confused as to why a 15, 20-minute drive across town is an excuse for not actually making that effort. And we can talk about being busy all day long, but then we sit and binge watch Netflix for 2, 3, 4 hours. And so it just doesn't really add up. At the end of the day, we make time for what is important. And if for some reason you're avoiding connection with other human beings, and I say this, I know we're laughing, but there's a serious side of this too. There are various reasons that at times we avoid connecting with other people. There was actually a significant time a number of years ago where I kind of stepped back from the industry because I was dealing with some personal stuff. And honestly, this podcast was a way for me to kind of get back and reconnect with the industry on a virtual level. But then, of course, I've had the opportunity to be able to connect with our guests in person, to do interviews in person, and also at conferences, as you alluded to, Lucy. The Cookout Conference is
top 3 for me and top even 2 for me in the industry.
Absolutely.
For the significance of focus on community. I mean, it feels like you're hanging out with family, and there's nothing that can replace that. Now, at the end of the day, we want to learn as well. We want to grow in other ways, but there is something significant to be said for connecting with another human being in person, especially one that you can relate to because of your profession or other things that you're going through in life. And we need that. Have Facebook, have Instagram, have all the things, but make time to connect in person, because you're missing out if not. And I'm glad that you bring that up. But I want to keep moving because we really do have so much to cover here. Talk to me about.
I told you I used to be a therapist, so we can get off on tangents all day. I'm like, let's just dive into all the things.
And please, well, and I have a bit of an obsession with psychology. In fact, that may be like a third or fourth career down the road for me. In all seriousness, I actually applied to go back to school for psychology. So.
Look at you. That's awesome.
We're kind of I'm doing the backwards route. You came into photography. I may end up leaving the industry to go do that, sometime in the future. Nowhere near.
But life is flexible. Go for it. That's awesome.
It's kind of cool. Yeah, maybe that's a conversation for another time. But nonetheless, I do want to talk about time. Speaking of time, how do you create time for yourself, for the important people in your life, despite being a business owner, having so many different things going on?
Yeah. So I've got 2 kids at home. At home, they live in my house. My boys are 6 and 9.5. So one of the things I really had to learn over the years is that you're going to have different phases of life. You're going to have different availability at different points. But at this phase of my life, kind of honoring the phase that I was in when I had babies, when things were crazy, there was no clocking out, because I was always nursing a baby while sending an email or whatever. But today, with a 6 and a 9.5-year-old in my house, I am finally in a phase where I can say, I give myself permission to fully clock out at a certain time every day. And that has been huge. I know it's a lot easier said than done, especially for parents who are also trying to juggle working in their home. I'm literally talking to you at my main workspace, which is a little corner between my kitchen, dining room, and living room, because I needed to be able to watch my kids while multitasking and getting my work done. This is another little secret. I was literally teaching a photography workshop from the hospital bed the day my youngest was born. So
really, how in the world did you do that?
The magic of the internet. But it was. I had, listen, you don't get a paid maternity leave as a small business owner, right?
Fair.
And the bills don't take a break. And so I knew I needed to be able to keep my income steady. And the way that I kind of worked around taking time off from shooting was teaching, which thankfully I was able to do. And everybody in the workshop was like, you are insane. Why are you logging on today? But it was, I did it because I was able to do it. This is, the juggling act that we as small business owners sometimes have to do. But again, thankfully, when I was in the thick of it, that felt insane. And I frequently I did the whole stay up till 2 a.m. to get work done thing for a couple of years. And the thing that I want to say to any parents who are also small business owners who might still be in the thick of it is that now I can say again that was a phase, and now I'm in a new phase. And thankfully my boys, now I can sit here and knock out a couple of emails while they're sitting next to me doing homework. And, I have a lot more flexibility. I'm able to say, guys, threaten, don't you dare make a sound because I have to make a phone call or something. And they get it. Yeah. But also being able to fully clock out by a certain time in the day has been huge. It's been huge for not only my relationship with my family, but also just my mental health and my clarity. It's amazing. You think that time management, like you said, is all about productivity and you have to get things done. But so much of that is also about making the space for mental clarity. And that just, you can't reach new goals if you don't even take the time to daydream about what that could look like. So I'm finally in a place where I can log off usually by 5, sometimes 6 o'clock in the evening. Some days it's like 2 p.m. And I still am able to deliver everything I need to get done, but also be with my family and be with myself. I've started like taking up other hobbies, which is amazing. I do like 1,000-piece puzzles, and I've been reading for pleasure a ton. And that's just like, it feels indulgent sometimes as a small business owner, because you're thinking like, I'm not making money right now. I could just be sitting at my computer making more money, but your brain can only hold so much, and you need to be able to feed it in other ways besides just work.
Well, it can only hold so much. And I mean, in my mind anyway, and this is, I guess, a bit subjective, but this is something I've actually been dealing with personally. We need to, you were talking about the significance of actually taking time to just kind of breathe and be, and, put a puzzle together or daydream. Mm-hmm. If we're constantly going, and just doing all the time, A, and then B, also consuming all the time, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or YouTube or emails or otherwise, and we never give our minds space to think, or just, again, to let thoughts flow, let them be and let them go, which really is the summation of meditation, at least in one form, then mentally, we're not going to have the clarity. I've even found that my memory has suffered significantly. My creativity has suffered significantly when I've not given myself that space. So I've actually blocked off mornings now. I have it in my calendar just labeled as something like management time, but that's so that moving forward, I can have the space to brainstorm. I can have the space to think freely, to journal, to create, and ultimately to do some of the big picture things that I need to as a company owner and CEO. Because if I'm just going all the time and reacting and responding, whether it's to clients or to my team, I'm not going to be nearly as, productive in a bigger picture level. First of all, as much as, like you were pointing out, Lucy, people think that it's kind of counterintuitive to take the break, but the reality is it can actually hurt our productivity. It can hurt our creativity if we don't give ourselves that space. But it's also going to affect my mental, emotional, psychological health. And that's something that we need to consider as well. So I'm really glad that you bring this to bear and bring this to conversation. It's something that we all need to hear, be reminded of, and that we need to ultimately figure out how to do in our day-to-day lives. It makes a big, big difference. All right, so I want to jump to the next question then. And we already alluded to Donald Miller earlier, but besides building a story brand, of course, we'll link to that in the show notes for everybody who's listening. Is there another self-help or business book that's made a big difference in your life in the last few years?
Okay. Yes, definitely. Like I said, I read a lot. Okay. So I'm going to throw out a bunch of titles and you can pick which one you want to zero in on. But the Pumpkin Plan was a big one a couple of years ago, being able to give myself permission to say that client is not for me, and that's okay. We're going to keep it moving and work towards helping my actual target client. Big Magic, Elizabeth Gilbert, was huge for me. It's a little bit more out there, kind of woo for some people, but for me, it was helpful because she has this theory, this idea that ideas visit us, and that we can either accept those ideas and follow the course of creating and manifesting whatever that looks like for that idea, or we can kind of say, that's a great idea and I don't have to be the person to do it. And then if you say that, you can send the idea back out into the universe and somebody else might be visited by that same idea. Again, I told you it's really woo.
I don't think so, though. It goes back to something I was alluding to a second ago, the significance of meditation. We've talked about this here on the podcast before, but there's a great book called Untethered Soul by Michael Singer. And he describes meditation as that behavior. Well, first of all, he communicates the significance of understanding that everything that we do, or everything ultimately that we interact with, we can consider. And this is literally everything, not just physical objects, but emotions or thoughts. We can engage with them as objects as well. And we have the ability to choose how to engage with them. So when it comes to meditation, a lot of people are like, I can't think about anything. I have to sit here in the quiet and not think about anything. What he suggests is you engage with that those thoughts, those ideas as objects, and you see them, you acknowledge them, and you also see them out, and kind of, as you were saying, put them back out into the universe. So that's what it reminds me of, actually. And I think it's a reminder of a really powerful principle that we can choose how to engage with ideas or feelings.
Absolutely. And for me, that whole concept, like I'm an overthinker, I'm a dreamer, and I tend to be this person that gets a billion ideas and just like wants to run with all of them. So kind of recognizing that like you can have an idea and it's okay to still let it go, even if it's a fantastic idea, that really relieved a lot of the pressure that I put on myself of like, you have to do all the things right now, because as you, I'm sure, know, and lots of other people who are business owners or creative people know, like you can't do all of the things well. So being able to just respect that was a lovely idea, and I'm glad that I had that idea or that it visited me, but like today is not my day to do that. Maybe it will visit somebody else and they'll be able to give it the respect that it needs. Really relieved a lot of the pressure I was putting on myself.
Well, we'll make sure to link to both the Pumpkin Plan and Big Magic in the show notes. Big Magic has come up before. Pumpkin Plan is not one. I don't think anybody has brought that up that I can remember, but we'll put both of those in the show notes. And by the way, for everybody listening in, if you go to Bokeh, BOKH in addition to the Bokeh bookshelf that I mentioned earlier, there are show notes that go with each of these episodes, and quite detailed show notes at that. So links to the resources, books that we talk about, and also the talking points from the discussion. And so make sure to capitalize on that. Take advantage of those show notes at bokehpodcast.com or in the show notes section of your podcast app. So as we continue on, we have to at least briefly touch on photography, Lucy. What is the most unusual item in your camera bag that enables you to be a better photographer? Ideally, it's not a lens or a camera. Is there something else that's maybe a little bit more unique?
When I say that I am a mom, I mean that I was like living the mom life before I even had kids, because I am always over prepared for life. And also my camera bag is also my purse. So typically when I'm out on a shoot, I not only have my camera and lenses, but I also have Band-Aids, tissues, cough drops, hand sanitizer, lotion. Like I've got the full deal.
Yeah.
And like basically the only thing I don't have in my purse is a diaper. Thankfully we're out of that phase, but like, especially because I work with little ones, it comes in handy so frequently. And there's nothing worse than like a crusty, snotty nose to ruin your pictures, or a kid who's like joyfully running through the park and like scrapes their knee and then like is just beside themselves. It's always amazing to me how easily Band-Aids can solve a problem.
Yeah, almost like having just like a general quote unquote emergency kit with you.
Yep.
It's so great.
I'm that person.
Well, but that contributes to the experience. I mean, you talk about the fun experience you're going to deliver, and that's probably what is going to be, at least in most cases, most memorable for the client. But it's funny how simple things like being able to pull a Band-Aid out of your purse and hand that to them if one of the kids does scrape their knee, how that can make a big difference in the client's experience of you. You were ready, right. You were prepared, you were kind, you were helpful. I think that's really a great reminder for all of us. So shout out to those who already are doing something like this. But if you're not, throw together a little kit. I think that's a really, really great idea. Let me keep going though, because I mentioned we were going to talk about how to plan your next personal project. You and I had the opportunity, as I said earlier in the podcast, to chat at the Cookout Conference. And by the way, we'll link to the conference in the show notes too. It's actually coming to Chattanooga, where I live, this year. It's really, really exciting. By the way, if you've never been to Chattanooga, this is not only a great opportunity to visit an incredible little town, but in addition, come to one of the best conferences in the industry. And so we'll link to that in the show notes. But we had the opportunity to chat about a personal project that you have launched. Will you share that project with our listeners?
Sure. So the project is called 100 Black Dads, and it is basically just, I share, it's a little bit like set up as in the format of Humans of New York, since a lot of people are familiar with that, where I pair one photo of my subject and then I pair it with a quote from them. And I send out like a little questionnaire to gather quotes about their experiences and how they might want to engage with the topic. But the main purpose is to highlight, I kind of use this language a lot in my talking around the project. It's to highlight the nurturing and loving side of Black fathers. Because I came to a point in my life when I realized that that's not the popular media portrayal. And I felt that there was a huge gap that wasn't what most people think of when they think of a Black man and a Black father. So I decided to provide a platform for men to be able to share their side of the story.
Wow. And it's a beautiful thing too. For everybody listening in, if you go to Lucy, Lucy, Baber, Baber, photography.com, there's actually a link in the navigation there. It says 100 Black Dads, and you click on that, scroll down a little bit, and there's a summation of the concept behind this project. And then, as Lucy was pointing out, you can click on these thumbnails. I'm going to click on one here that says Lee, number 53. Takes me to a different page, and there are a couple of pictures of Lee with his kids, and then the quote that Lucy mentioned, in this case by Lee: "Raising my children in today's society won't be drastically different from when I was coming up. I always tell them the truth about the society and what they can expect from it. My son at age 7 knows a lot more about his surroundings than I did at his age. The Black Lives Matter movement has brought more awareness to our troubles with social injustice and systematic racism, even though these have been obvious issues for centuries." And I mean, it's thought-provoking, certainly beautiful capture of the relationship in these couple of images between Lee and his kids. And it's a really interesting concept and project. I have to ask though, I mean, this is also a relatively sensitive topic. Have you gotten any kind of pushback? What's the conversation like been around the project, or has it just been overwhelmingly positive? What's it been like?
So thankfully, I live in a part of the country and am immersed in the community that is exceptionally open-minded and so has been really supportive of the project itself. Even, I mean, I'm trying not to get too political because I don't know how political you like to get on your podcast, but my parents don't live in that kind of an area. Sure. Where, you know, like I live in Mount Airy, Philadelphia, which has kind of gotten like national recognition for being this like beautiful utopia of diversity and acceptance. So it's super easy for me here. But even amongst, you know, my network back at home where my parents live, I have mixed feelings about it because I have gotten a lot of support, but it's almost like, to some people it might feel sensitive, but it's almost like it's still too easy because I'm handing these really positive images over. I don't know. There's a lot to be said for how people's perspectives change about Black children when they get to a certain age. And so these are cute pictures. They're happy pictures. They're loving. But I have worked really hard to try to capture a broader scope of imagery. You know, like not every dad is wealthy or wearing a suit and tie or whatever. And that was really a big part of my goal for the project, was to show not only that, to kind of buck the stereotype that like, there's the stereotype that a lot of Black fathers are either dangerous or in some way, or doing criminal activity, or they're just checked out completely from their kids' lives. So not only are they engaged with their kids, but they're also doing that in a variety of lifestyles. So, you know, like one of the sessions I did, the dad he's raising his daughter in his mom's house. Another one, he is co-parenting with his partner in like Section 8 housing. You know, I wanted to be able to show that like whatever your idea of quote unquote a good Black father might be, like let's push that even farther. Yeah. Because especially these smaller, more rural areas, smaller towns in the country, I recognize they still might not even have exposure to these ideas that a person can live a different life than you and still be doing the right thing and living. Like it seems so basic to me, but I recognize that not everybody is exposed to that.
Yeah, that's a great, and you mentioned the significance of perspective earlier. Perspective really is everything. I think a lot of my conversations around race and racism, I think, are kind of skewed in a way because I actually grew up in a foreign country. I grew up in Japan, spent about 10 years of my life there. where, I mean, I was the kid with blonde hair and blue eyes amidst a culture which looked vastly different. I mean, to the extent that they would come up and ask for pieces of my hair because I look so different. But I know what it's like to be in a culture that isn't naturally my own, and to be made fun of or given a hard time, bullied or otherwise because of that, or partially because of that. And so, ultimately I'm an idealist. I'm kind of a simplicity freak, and it includes some of my thoughts about various, in some cases, sensitive issues. But I want to connect with fellow human beings as fellow human beings, and we may look different, we may lead different lives, but the idea that we have to clarify, like you were saying, Lucy, that we have to clarify that just because somebody looks different or lives differently than us doesn't mean that what they're doing is, quote, wrong or bad or less than or otherwise. I mean, it's ridiculous and sad ultimately that we have to clarify these very basic things. I love that you have been proactive. It's one thing to get on Facebook and talk about political issues, and particularly topics around race and racism. But I love that you have just been proactive in this. You saw an opportunity and you wanted to make a difference, and you've done something about it. And I'm curious, actually, for the sake of our listeners in this conversation too, I mean, was this the first effort that you made at a larger personal project like this, or had you tried others before this?
So I mean, yes and no. This was definitely the largest and most committed scale. I've done, like smaller personal projects that were more focused around taking specific kinds of photos of my family. But this was the first project that was focused on giving back to somebody that wasn't myself. Yeah. And also that had a really clearly defined mission and scope.
Well, I mean, again, it's beautifully done. And by the way, I love too that you in a sense took a risk, because these conversations around race are extremely sensitive, or I guess maybe volatile is probably the better word, because many times people's motivations are questioned. Assumptions are made, projections happen. And
right. And I usually have to say on a podcast, especially, like, fellow listeners, I am white. So since you can't see me, that was a risk, definitely, because I wanted to make sure that everything that I did was not only sensitive to the needs of the community I was aiming to highlight, but also that I didn't overstep any boundaries that, like, you only know how much you know. So yeah. I did a lot of like checking in with others who are a part of that community to make sure, like, is this something that would be welcome? Am I going about it in the right way? And do you think people would want to see this? Or, like, do you think this is valuable and helpful? If I had gotten the answer that no, this is not, I would have stepped back. I've also been willing to tweak as time goes on. One thing that crosses my mind is initially I was going to keep all of the dads unnamed, like anonymous. My background in mental health, I think, contributed to that idea that, sure, like, we don't need names because you don't need to identify people. But I kind of, at some point, one dad kind of challenged me on that. And he was like, I want people to know that a man named, I'll say, I don't remember which dad it was, but I'll say one of my close friends' names because I know he won't mind. A man named Khalif can be out here raising his daughter just like a man named Tom or Mike or Joe. And so I changed that, and I was willing to kind of revisit it. I put it out there to the other dads and said, do you agree with this? Is this something that you support? And overwhelmingly, they were like, yes, absolutely. Cool. I want my name out there so that people can start to change their stereotypes and their ideas about what a man named Khalif might look like and be like.
But again, props to you for stepping out and doing this. And you did it in a very intelligent way. And that, as you pointed out, you got the feedback, well, ultimately, that you needed to approach this in a way that, and sensitively, and be able to bring this project to bear in a way that would make a positive difference versus, I mean, if you had just gone about it, it's amazing how people, especially in 2020 culture and social media, it's very easy to just get on Facebook and type away and share ideas, many of which come from, ironically, assumption, projection, or otherwise. And And, somebody could take this project and misconstrue it and say, how dare you? What are you suggesting that Black fathers even need a project like this? And somehow twist it negatively. So it was a risk. But again, you took that risk in an intelligent way. You got feedback. You asked advice. And I think this is a great example for our listeners. But if our listeners are interested in starting some type of a personal photographic project themselves, there might be some steps to consider. You actually shared a list of them with me, and I'm going to list them here really quick, and then maybe we can go back through and touch on each one of them. You said first, write a mission statement, then clearly define your scope and goals. You said write a press release, then determine the budget, availability, and potential travel needs for both shooting and planning promotion. Apply for grants and sponsorships. Consider wardrobe needs for promo interviews. Plan your lunch. Create a mix of easily attainable and big and scary goals for how you want to present the final product. And then outsource if possible. Can we just touch on each one of these? Let's start with the mission statement. What does that mean to you, writing a mission statement, especially for a project like this?
Sure. So I had with the, first I want to step back and say that I did not do some of these very well. So part of my thinking when I wanted to share a list for other photographers was, please don't make some of the same mistakes that I did, because your life will be so much easier if you do take the time to go through this process up front. Even if you don't think it's going to be a big deal, with the digital age that we live in, I was kind of blown away by how quickly the project got picked up and went viral. And a little bit of it got outside of my ability to control. And therefore that I feel like in a lot of ways, my kind of viral moment for this project came and went very quickly because I wasn't prepared. So hopefully, if you do have a personal project and you do have it go a little bit viral, you will be better prepared to kind of ride the wave and maximize that opportunity by doing these things. But specifically for a mission statement, especially because, like you said, the topic was sensitive in nature, and I wanted to make sure that I honored my vision for the project and stuck to those goals. I really the idea of a mission statement sounds so boring and so tedious, but so I don't even think I wrote an official paragraph at first. I think I just brainstormed and did one of those, I think some people call it a mind map or a web, the old school stuff that you did in high school when you were planning to write a paper or something. So I just wrote down just a brain dump of all the thoughts, all the different things that were going through my head about the project. I had to talk it out. I talked it out a lot with my husband. What if I come across this thing? What if I'm faced with this question? And I just put it all on paper to be able to see it clearly. And it's really helped. It wasn't just the PR stuff came later, but initially it helped not only for promotional purposes, but also because there have been points in time when I've said, why am I still doing this? This project, by the way, started November 2016. This is going into my 4th year now, which I did not anticipate it would take that long. Initially, people said 100 Black dads. Why aren't you doing 1,000? Why do you even have to put a number on it? We've got tons of dads who can do this. And, so I really have to, the answer to that is that, I have had more than 100 Black dads respond with interest. But the thing about finding dads who want to volunteer for a project showing off their great dadness is that a lot of people are out here having a life. So scheduling and syncing up between my schedule and theirs has been tricky for a lot of people because they're out here coaching basketball and they're out here. One of my dad volunteers is a local politician and he's, either campaigning or doing his actual work. I've got doctors and lawyers who have crazy schedules. I've got dads who are at church all weekend from Friday night until Sunday night. So that was a little bit tricky, but also, being able to define how far I would travel, being able to come back to say just even something as simple as saying the goal of this project is to work with showing the nurturing and loving sides of Black fatherhood helps me to kind of keep coming back to what is my vision for this photo? Yeah. What do I hope to get out of our time together when I'm shooting? What do I want to there's also a process of like selecting the quote that goes with the photo. And sometimes these dads want to write like a book to answer some of the questions I have in my questionnaire. And so I have to pull what is the most meaningful part of their quote that also is unique for the broader story, but also speaks to their individual story.
Well, there are a lot of moving parts. Yeah, I mean,
there's a lot of moving parts, and
so many moving parts, and a lot to keep up with. And at the end of the day, and I'm sure different photographers listening can relate to this idea. If you don't have an idea that is bigger than yourself, that is also tied to your value set, that is driving what you do, it is going to be much easier to give up or to burn out or otherwise. Having that underlying idea that drives what you are doing, in this case, this personal project, is really, really important. Being clear about it, writing it down, being able to come back to it, so important. But it ties to the next point, Lucy, that you shared, which is, and you kind of alluded to this a second ago, clearly defining your scope and goals. I mean, what I've found is if we know the big idea that drives what we do, then it makes it easier as well to set specific goals. What does that goal setting look like for you?
So it's changed over the course of the project. Initially, it was looking a little bit more like, this is the number of shoots I want to do per month. This is my availability. But also, it really ties into some of the other points, like how far am I willing to travel? I have had to revisit the question. Initially, I told myself I wanted to take every single photo of the dads with their kids in their home, because that was a big part of my vision, was being able to show like where they actually live and what, some people might not even know what a Black family's living room looks like. So like showing them that it could look lots of different ways, and everyone, is living a different life, and that's okay. But 4 years in now, I'm realizing maybe I need to broaden that a little bit because of my own availability to travel and scheduling needs. So I've kind of expanded that to include and their local community and whatever they are plugged into, so that I can include shoots that are at the local playground or at a local park or whatever. Yeah. So being able to define that and then kind of be flexible within that as well.
Well, yeah, and otherwise I can imagine it would get, number one, it would get chaotic, but two, it could get out of hand. I mean, you get these personal projects that probably in most cases aren't bringing in any income. You still have to run an actual business on top of it. You've got to create some structure and some limitations ultimately somewhere. So it is important to be really specific about those and to do that up front so that you can use that as a filter. You know when to say yes, when to say no, how much to do. You mentioned writing a press release is the third point. Writing a press release in my mind sounds like something from 1975. It seems like such an old school thing to do, but I realize it's still relevant. What does that process look like in this case?
So I still am not an expert on this piece, but what I learned is that outside of people contacting me to find out more and to maybe interview me for a piece or something, there was initially, especially, a little bit of me needing to put the project in people's faces. And a press release to me really just provides the consistent language to be able to put it in front of lots of people. So that you're not, again, constantly recreating the wheel. You don't have to come up with it on the fly every single time, and it might look different. A press release is just a place to put all of the things like your mission, your scope, your goals, all in one place, so that you can share it with whomever you might need to share that with. I actually outsourced that piece because I've gotten such overwhelming support. I've had a lot of people ask how can I help? How can I support this? And my cousin, who doesn't even do press releases for a living, from what I can tell, she just wanted to help and said, I can Google it and figure out how to do this, said, let me write a press release. And so I was like, awesome. And so now I have that again, it provides that consistent language. When somebody does ask for, a write-up, I can send that. And then it allows anybody who wants to interview me or do a feature on the project, it gives them that lead in writing so that they have the same language to just throw it together.
Okay. And then you've alluded to this at least a couple of times already. You talk about budget availability and then potential travel needs for both shooting and planning promotion. I can imagine that this in many ways kind of ties to the idea of defining scope and goals. Again, you could spend endless amounts of money on this personal project, and that probably doesn't make sense financially and certainly for your business. What does it look like to define the budget, the availability, and ultimately the travel? How are you able to communicate that effectively? I mean, you put the word out that you've got this project going. I'm sure the response at times has been really incredible, but I can only imagine that you have to say no as well.
Oh gosh, all the time, which is heartbreaking, especially because, so I started it November 2016. By April, May, June of 2017, I mean, rewind to that space for a minute. That was a really crazy time in the world. It was like a culmination of like Black Lives Matter peaking, and also post-election, there was a lot of just energy in the world that people wanted to be able to do all the things and help in whatever way they could. And that was around the same time that I got picked up by several news outlets, I guess I should say. I also managed to find, I don't even remember how he found me, but I got a volunteer that was very high profile for the project, and that helped to get a lot more visibility on it. I worked with Malcolm Jenkins from the Eagles, volunteered to participate, which was fantastic. Their family is fantastic. They're just lovely people. But having that high profile person really launched it into a different sphere very quickly, which I wasn't really prepared for. I was thinking, well, the time that I need to allot is like 2 to 4 shoots a month while, it was my slower season. I thought this is all I need to do. And then all of a sudden I had to also include things like how much time am I going to be able to devote to phone calls of people that want to interview me. The project was featured on Scary Mommy and HuffPost and Cafe Mom, and a local news outlet wanted to interview me on their morning show. So things got really ramped up very quickly, and I had not anticipated any of that. So once it kind of had that viral moment, I had people across the country volunteering. I had one person who said, like, when will you be in London? And I was like, well, I wasn't planning on coming to London. That's not really I feel like you might have this other idea of the kind of photographer I am. I'm just like a mom with 2 kids here. I don't really have a travel budget. I don't really have any of this in place. And unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier, I feel like because I didn't really anticipate how quickly, I feel like some of us are still kind of learning what virality can mean in this new time that we're in. But if you are not prepared to ride it, it will fall very, very fast. And it's a little bit like that 15 minutes of fame thing. Like I had it like exactly 15 minutes, but because I wasn't prepared to fund or like line up childcare for anything outside of that, like it fell apart very quickly. And unfortunately, because I really wanted this project to get as much visibility as possible, and it's your project is only limited by your own availability, and because I just wasn't in that space to be able to travel a lot, it got quiet again. It didn't fall flat on its face. I shouldn't say that, because the project's still going. I still feel connected to it. I'm still able to get it out there to people. But maybe if I had anticipated those needs a little bit better up front, I could have extended that visibility.
Well, anticipation is a really good word too, because I know that as artist types, and I'm certainly guilty of this, it's easy to get excited about a big idea and not think about all the moving parts, the details.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. And honestly, this is why this conversation specifically is so important, for a big part of why it's so important for our listeners. We have to remember that there are details, even for something as just wonderful as a personal project like this. We still have to think about the moving parts, or we can get eaten alive by the whole process. So
exactly.
I want to respect your time, and everybody listening in too. We have just a couple more points I want to touch on that you shared with me. You mentioned applying for grants and sponsorships. That's something that's probably foreign to most photographers. What did that process look like for you?
So it looked very foreign to me too. And that's one of the ones that I did not successfully pull off very well at all. I had a whole list of grants, and because the learning curve was so steep, one by one, all the deadlines passed before I really got my act together. I had all these ideas of sponsorships that I wanted to apply for, and one by one, those felt too big and daunting. So I included it though, because I do feel like it would have been extremely valuable. And again, if you can find a way to get ahead of that and maybe do your research or find a way to outsource that piece and find somebody to do some admin work for you behind the scenes to help, hopefully you'll have a stronger foundation to start with than I did. If I had had some grants and sponsorships though, if I had had any amount of cash flow to be able to support the project, I might have been able to travel to London, or I might have been able to, do some of the other work to promote it that I wanted to. Instead, what ended up happening is I did more private solicitation. Some of the dads themselves have chipped in to be able to support financially. And again, it's like, I'm not making any money off of this. It's really just paying for my travel and my time, which was a little bit hard to wrap my head around because it's not a for-profit project, but you still are giving resources that are taking away from your work, your paid work. Right. And so being able to kind of rectify that in my head that it's okay to accept donations was a process for me. I also have a very, very small Patreon account that like 5 people donate to every month, which is so lovely. But, just if I had dedicated some more time to that piece, it could have been a lot more sustainable.
Well, again, these are moving parts that probably many of us wouldn't consider. So I'm glad that I appreciate the fact that, first of all, you're transparent about how you didn't really know how to go about it, so it didn't work out in the end. But we have to at least consider the significance of the financial pieces necessary to make a project like this happen. It's definitely a good reminder. I wish I had grant experience to speak from, but for those of you listening in, make sure that you have considered the financial pieces of a personal project, especially of one of this scope, because you have to consider how it does affect your personal financial status, but then also the finances of your business as well. You still have a business to run, and that's important to keep in mind. You mentioned considering wardrobe needs for promo interviews. I think that kind of speaks for itself. I want to jump to the next point though. Plan your lunch, and this could probably be an episode in and of itself. Can you just briefly sum up what that looked like, and what our listeners should keep in mind?
So for me, it really came down to like deciding on the platforms that I would host the images. So making the decision. I've kept it on my website mostly because I am still running a business and I feel like the traffic really helps that piece. But also because I didn't have the time to create a new website. But I did create separate social media accounts for the project. And also, one of the biggest ways that the project got started for me was tapping into my newsletter. So I have a nice newsletter of paying clients that I've worked with, and just being able to announce, I'm doing a thing. Do you know anyone that wants to volunteer? Or do you have ideas for any part of it? And that really helped to kind of kickstart things. It was one of my paying clients was the very first volunteer for the project, so I was able to see their family again. And then it kind of took off from there. I solicited names of other people that might be interested. I emailed them directly, and then, eventually it took off and had a whole movement of its own. But yeah, being able to know how you're going to communicate and how you're going to share the images is obviously a part of it.
And then, tied very closely to this idea of a launch is understanding what goals you have. We've spoken to the idea of goals already, but when you talk about creating a mix of easily attainable and then big and scary goals for how you want to present the final product, what did that actually look like on a practical level?
So I'm still figuring that out, to be honest. I've said from the start that I would love to turn this into a book. I haven't, because I'm only about halfway through the 100. So because I'm not quite at the 75% mark is when I really wanted to be able to pitch this to some kind of either print lab or publisher. I haven't even decided on that piece. But the big scary part is the book. So deciding that I'd love to do that, but also, easily attainable things like local gallery shows are still on my radar to be able to do once I feel like I'm kind of winding down with the shooting piece. I did, like the promotional stuff was cool. Some of it kind of fell into my lap, but like one thing I did that was really interesting is I was invited to I don't even remember. There was a student art show at Temple University here in Philly that they just reached out and they were like, we're having this cookout for this one sorority and it's going to be a lot of Black fathers there. And we want to just kind of give you a chance to share the project with them. And also maybe you can give back as a local artist by judging this student art show. So little things like that kind of popped up that were like I said, kind of easily attainable, allowed me to kind of present the project and feel like I was doing something besides just taking photos and posting them online.
And a lot of it probably, a lot of those opportunities come from just making an effort on a proactive level at conversation and sharing the project in conversation. Online certainly, but in conversation even, because some people may not be following your brand. They're not aware. You share that, and then they share that with their friends, and it gets out, and opportunities come as a result. Have you had those experiences where a conversation turns into a photo shoot?
Absolutely. I am very introverted in real life. So probably not as many opportunities as, say, an extrovert might have.
Okay.
My kids are in a very diverse public school, and there are dads that I see every single day that I'm still too shy to actually be like, hey, do you want to volunteer for this? But it is what it is. There's certainly been other opportunities where word of mouth and casual conversations have led to something else, and they've volunteered for the project or helped me promote it and been really excited about it. You
mentioned outsourcing earlier, and this is the last talking point, but how can you list the various ways that outsourcing has played a role in this personal project for you?
I wish I had thought to do it earlier and more effectively. But again, my cousin was able to do the press release. I wish that I had tapped into more grant writing friends to be able to help me with that piece. But also outsourcing, one of the decisions I made about a year or two in was to bring on, I guess, kind of associate photographers for the project. That's been, I love both of the ladies that I've worked with, Sabrina Guyton here in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, and Ray Adesina. She's just a force in herself. She's
Ray
amazing.
Is amazing. We actually she was back in Bokeh Podcast episode number 200.
Yep.
Just a beautiful, beautiful personality and one of the most talented boudoir photographers that I've seen to date. Just amazing.
She really is. And I'm thrilled that she's really found her niche. Before she was really taking off with boudoir, she had been focusing a lot on families. And so it seemed like a really natural fit for her to join this project. But then, life happens. Sabrina had another baby. Ray has kind of taken off in a different direction. And they're both a part of the project. They both contributed images and helped me find more volunteers. But that piece has quieted down a little bit because they've gone off and done amazing things elsewhere. So, there's pros and cons to outsourcing the photography piece, but I'm so glad, especially because, as I mentioned, being a white photographer, trying to capture a different demographic than my own, being able to bring in two Black women photographers was important to me to be able to kind of, again, remove myself and say, this isn't about me necessarily. This is about this platform we want to provide to support Black men.
Yeah.
And it really doesn't even come down to my art necessarily. It's about how we can help to tell that story.
Well, I really appreciate you making so much time to share with me, with our listeners today about not only the project, but what you've learned through the process. And like it or not, there are, and I'm reminded of this pretty consistently because, again, I tend to be a bit of a simpleton in my approach to life and business. And I forget that there are a lot of moving parts underneath, or maybe I just choose to ignore the moving parts underneath. But at the end of the day, we have to remember that that there are multiple elements at play when we launch a project like this. And I really appreciate you walking us through, reminding us of that, but then walking us through that process a little bit. I know that you offer some mentoring and teaching or coaching. Where can our listeners learn a little bit more about that and just generally follow you online as well?
So my website is obviously the best source for all the information, lucybaberphotography.com. I always say it's B-A-B as in boy, E-R, because a lot of people misspell my last name. And on that website, there is a whole page dedicated to the 100 Black Dads project. At the top, there's a link. And there's also a link to, I don't remember what I'm calling it right now. It's either mentoring
mentorship. Yeah, is actually what it says.
Okay, I was like, or it's for photographers. Yeah, there's a link to information about my mentorships. So you can contact me directly to find out more about that. I am, just in 2020, I've launched a new small group mastermind and hoping to add another one in a couple of months. So I'm always happy to help other photographers. You can also follow me on Facebook, Lucy Baber Photography, or you can follow 100 Black Dads Project. And on Instagram, my handle is @LucyBaber, or you could follow @100 Black Dads Project.
Cool. And we're going to actually link to all this in the show notes too. So for everybody listening in, all you have to do is just go to bokehpodcast.com or to the show notes. At the show notes there at bokehpodcast.com, but you can also go to the show notes in your podcast player and see that information there as well. Thanks once again, Lucy, for hanging out with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Bokeh Podcast. Will you let us know what you thought by leaving a review of the podcast in the Apple Podcast app? And I'd love to hear from you personally with your thoughts about the podcast and suggestions about future topics and guests for the show. My email is nathan@photographersedit.com. The Bokeh Podcast is brought to you by Milu, the simplest way for photographers and coordinators to collaborate on shot lists and timelines for weddings, parties, and other amazing events. Visit Milu, MIILU.com. This podcast is also brought to you by Photographer's Edit, custom image editing for the professional photographer. Visit photographersedit.com.